Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tri-Mechanics podcast. So we're throwing them out a bit thick and fast at the moment because I want to cover a lot of these subjects that have come up recently, particularly people are kind of debating about, thinking about, and I want to try and provide a little bit of information so that you can go out and kind of essentially find your own answers. So a lot of it is about self-experimentation, this idea that if you're with a little bit of information, you can go and find out what actually works best for you, because that's the end of the day, that's the most important thing. If it works best for you and you feel good, with regards to whether it's nutrition, whether it's shoes, or those things, then that's really the most important thing. But sometimes it does help to have a little bit of direction. So today's episode is going to be a little different. So rather than me coming up with the topics, this time we've got a few questions from some of our listeners that I'm going to then go over just to give a little bit more information, but also just, as I say, hopefully provide some answers to those people and maybe anyone else that's suffering with similar problems. So the first question I'm going to attack is the idea of Achilles tendinosis, or whatever you want to call it. So it's a really interesting topic when it comes to the Achilles, because you've really got to start off with thinking about what the Achilles actually is. If you look down at it, you can see that one of the characteristics of it is that it's quite pronounced, it's quite proud, and it's very movable from side to side. If you relax the calf and relax your leg, you can see how much it moves. Now, this is really important. That point is very, very important. It's probably the reason why we tend to get a lot of Achilles issues, because a lot of Achilles issues aren't really the Achilles tendon itself. That's the critical thing, is that most of the time, they're actually the sheath around the Achilles. And actually, one of the best treatments for a chronic Achilles issue, when the sheath has become very gristly, and there's lots of fibrous tissue there, is actually to go in with a needle between the sheath and the Achilles tendon itself and put in basically what's called a high volume injection. So you inject a load of salty water, and what it does, it rips the sheath off the Achilles. Because what can often happen is the sheath gets damaged. That stimulates an inflammatory change. If that continues over and over and over again, so if we don't get a hold on that kind of healing process, the long-term changes when you've got that kind of tissue is that you can actually stimulate to grow nerves and blood vessels into that tissue. Now, this itself can cause lots of problems, but it also can cause an increase in, obviously, pain sensation because of the nerves. So by going in there with that injection, you can actually rip essentially the sheath off the tendon and solve a lot of pain problems. It's probably the most effective treatment for that illness. But the other key thing is essentially, why is it happening? So I'm going to go over a little bit about why it happens, or why it might happen, or the most likely causes, and they're probably not what people are going to think they are. What you can essentially think about starting to do about it in terms of repair and recovery. What definitely not to do. And essentially, hopefully, that'll give you some information about essentially trying to fix it. So we know that what's going on most likely is that we've got an irritation in that sheath, particularly around the Achilles. And one reason why that happens, if you look down at your Achilles, look down at your lower leg, if you imagine your gastrocnemius muscle, that's that two-headed calf muscle on the back of your leg, acting like someone holding a water ski. So if you were to hold a water ski and essentially you were trying to basically go with two arms or two positions into one, and the idea is that if you wanted to essentially change that position, you could pull on one arm on the other arm to essentially tilt yourself. And that's essentially how the Achilles really works from that perspective, or how the gastrocnemius and Achilles come together to work. The key thing is that they do a lot of control and stabilization, but also the Achilles is absolutely critical to elastic recoil in the lower leg. So therefore takes a lot of load as we come into land on the forefoot. Now the critical thing is that we've had a misguided impression that therefore that means that we shouldn't be landing on the forefoot, that we should be landing more on the heel to stop that overload, that we should be loading up the heel of the shoe with a shoe wedge, or that we should be controlling movement with orthotics or motion control shoes. None of these things are the right way to go. They're not the natural way to go. They're not the way that the body actually wants. They are essentially just crutches. Like orthotics, like all these things, they are just crutches. They're like plaster casts covering a wound or a broken limb, should I say, and they don't do anything about what's going on underneath. They sometimes can offload the tendon so that it can allow things to essentially heal, or the area to heal, but then you have to get rid of them. The whole thing is if you get used to them, then it doesn't really change anything. The critical thing is that most Achilles sheath issues are three-dimensional. It's normally the heel moving around all over the place, out of control. And the reason that happens is twofold. Or the reason that I see most predominantly is hip instability or hip issues, lateral hip issues, i.e. the issues on the sides of the hips that mean that you cross over more into the centre as you come into land to stabilise yourself, because the big glute muscles on the outside of the hips aren't fully functioning, working properly, means that you're landing at a severe angle. This is what often causes the kind of the overpronation that's seen when you go to have your running gait looked at a shop, and that ends up with a kind of motion control shoe that's probably the wrong thing to do, because essentially what you want to do is sort out the hips. And that's a functional thing. That's not really supposed to be changed at the foot level. The other thing is that what you then do often is end up with a more cushioned shoe, like a Hoka, that's supposed to take the load off. But actually all that does, that spongy cushion, is make things worse. It makes things more unstable. If you think the critical problem is that the heel's flopping around all over the place and the Achilles is having to do extra work to essentially control it, but that is irritating the sides of the sheath, then you start to think, well, the one thing we want is to get the heel closer to the ground and in more control. So actually it might seem completely counterintuitive if you believe the hype of the shoe industry and orthotics and podiatrists, but actually we want the heel closer to the ground. We want less cushion. We want more control. That's what we want. We want to essentially be like we are barefoot. It is very difficult to get lower limb injuries when you run barefoot or when you do a lot of barefoot activity. And this is demonstrated in significant studies of populations that are fishermen, that are barefoot a lot of the time. They do not report any incidents of lower limb injury. That's the critical thing. Whereas when people wear shoes, they actually report much, much higher incidence of lower limb injury. And that's simply because that raise off the ground just changes that ability to stabilise. So what else is causing problems? So that is three-dimensional. So it's often a drop and a drop inwards. So the drop of the shoe does play a part, but it's not the actual causal factor. It's normally a side-to-side movement. So if you imagine looking at a landing foot from the back, it's the drop and then the rocking inwards. Now that's often compounded, as I say, by over-squidgy, over-cushioned shoes. Shoes that are too heavy, shoes that are not done up properly. Amount of runners that I see, probably, I'd say 75%, don't have their shoes done up properly, i.e. they have them flopping around, their heel is all over the place, and they have them too tight at the front because they think that they shouldn't be allowing those toes to move when they should, and then they don't use the holes all the way back, or they use elastic laces. You should feel like someone's grabbing you around the ankle. Now, the other key thing is if the shoe is too heavy and it flops around, that causes problems as well. So going for a nice lighter weight shoe with a lighter weight upper often solves a lot of those problems. Now, it might appear like it gets worse initially. That's the problem with a lot of these injuries. Often an Achilles injury, an Achilles sheath problem, will take months to fully rectify itself because it's taken months for the pain and the inflammation to essentially get there and do that damage. So it takes a long time. So it's a long game you have to play. One thing that can work is a technique I've used in the studio where you wrap what's called a voodoo band, or actually use a bike inner tube, where you wrap it around the lower leg, essentially just above the Achilles, very nice and tight, and then you descend onto, like, from essentially over the back of a step and move the ankle up and down. And the way that works is, I think we believe it kind of mats that fascia down, and then when you move the Achilles within it, it helps rip apart, doing a similar thing to the injection. Okay, so the critical thing with how it's starting to treat Achilles is, and the other thing is that you need to start trying to essentially increase its healing. So whatever you do, do not rest, ice, compression, and elevate. RICE is probably the worst protocol that's ever been come up with for sports injuries. It may initially allow an injury to be run on or played on in a critical match or a critical situation, but it inhibits long-term healing, as does ibuprofen. You must not touch ibuprofen. When it comes to painkillers, paracetamol is as good as you can get, as good as you should go as a runner, possibly codeine if pain is too great. The reason that is important is because both paracetamol and codeine affect the way the brain perceives pain. Ibuprofen and Voltarol and diclofenac and those kind of drugs, those NSAIDs or aspirin, they affect how the pain is modulated, i.e. where it's coming from, and the mechanism of the pain. The problem with that is that mechanism is there for a very, very good reason. It is a signal to your body to essentially bring in the good stuff, help repair and get rid of the bad stuff. Again, that is why you essentially get the swelling that you do not want to compress. Swelling is doing the same thing. When you get an injury, it creates a lot of inflammation or inflammation. That is not a bad thing. It is a very, very good thing. It should be red. It should be irritated. That increases blood flow. That increases all those good things coming in and taking away all the bad things. The way I describe healing from injury, and the reason that the lower limb is so tricky to essentially sort out and why it takes so long, is a bit like buses. In your mouth, when you get a cut, you notice it heals within a day or so. That's because in your mouth, blood flow is like London. London buses come every 30 seconds. In the foot, it's like where my parents live, which is one bus every Wednesday. The reason that is so important is because every time those buses come past, they bring in good stuff or they might take away bad stuff. That's the idea of blood flow. So whatever you can do to increase blood flow and not decrease it works. So heat works, massage works, basically the opposite of the RICE protocol. Don't elevate, don't ice, heat, massage, irritate, move around a lot. So just keep it moving, keep ambulating, keep essentially getting that walking. One of the best things for Achilles tendon problems, barefoot walking, or just walking in shoes that allow your foot to move around. That's the critical thing. So maybe sandals, something similar, or just walking. Walking can really help to get blood flow to that area. Yes, it's going to hurt. Yes, it's probably going to feel a bit gristly, but that is not a bad thing. You must never let pain dictate what you actually do when it comes to an Achilles. You must get it moving, and then you must start to think about footwear. So if you have a pair of shoes that have an orthotic in or have a big heel portion, they're probably what's causing that instability that is leading to the Achilles problem. Combining that with hip instability, and we've got problems. So you need to have your hips looked at, assessed to see when you're actually running, when you're running at actual speed, and having it slow motion videoed so that you can actually see what's going on, so that you can see those movements, so you can actually then see how to address it, and then spending the next few weeks or months fully addressing that stability. That will affect the root cause of the problem, rather than trying to just solve it at the foot level. Okay, so that's a little bit about Achilles tendinopathy or tendinosis. If you want to know any more information about that, then please send me any messages via Twitter and Facebook. We're on Twitter as Trimechanics, so follow us on there. If you want to ask any questions, and on Facebook, if you look at the Trimechanics Facebook page, ask any questions on there, and I'll try and respond to give a little bit more information, or when the cases are a little bit more unique. So the next question that I had was related to essentially feet and toes going numb. That seems to be more prevalent in the cold. Now, that's not uncommon. But actually, I mentioned on my last podcast that when you run barefoot, your feet tend to warm up because they're moving a lot. So one of the causes of cold and numb toes could be the fact that shoes are too narrow, particularly too constrictive. A lot of the blood vessels essentially supplying the foot run relatively superficially on the top, but the venous return, the blood flow going back, and the lymph sits around the skin and the top of the foot. And if you're very lean and you have your shoes done up ridiculously tight, particularly over the top. Now, I said this about obviously making sure your shoes are done up tight in terms around the ankle position, but maybe over the front of the foot, you should have it a little looser. The critical thing is if you tighten down, particularly if you're doing cross-country and you're in, unfortunately, a very narrow set of innervates, is a good example, that come up far too narrow, they will push the foot inwards, constricting a lot of that movement, but they'll also constrict the blood flow to the toes, so they can cause the toes to go numb. When you put your shoes on, you should be able to wiggle your toes. If you can't, then that's going to cause problems, as you've clearly got too much compression around those areas that are supplying them with blood. So what you need to do is essentially loosen things up. What I say to people is often things like taking the insole out can really help to work to give you a little bit more toe space. Most insoles just take away space. They don't really do very much. All they do is ride up at the sides, because they always end up being a little bit too wide for the shoe, and they just cause a loss in width. So what I want you to do is open up that kind of essentially the kind of toe box area. The other thing that was worth trying is if you are going to wear socks, then wearing woolen toe socks. They are the best thing for trail. They're made by a company called Injinji, and they're about £10. They are the best £10 you could ever spend. You can get them between various different thicknesses, so you can get very light and thin thickness, or you can get right up to kind of really thick, kind of for good trail or walking socks. But they are fantastic at modulating temperature and helping with that in terms of blood flow. But they'll also mean that you can have the shoe a little looser and not risk getting any blisters from friction. Most of the time, actually, most blisters come from heat buildup, but also friction on particularly polyester type static materials, and then that irritates the skin combined with the buildup of moisture. So I found that wearing woolen socks, you never get blisters at all. They are fantastic for any kind of longer running, trail running, or any cross-country races. So definitely look at those Injinji woolen socks. They're called Nuwool, Nuwool, Nuwool Injinji socks. Absolutely fantastic thing. The final question I got asked was about asthma. So asthma is interesting. It is a systemic inflammatory condition that tends to manifest in the lungs. It often has lots of other conditions. Now, the first thing about asthma I want to mention is that you have to also find out what might be exacerbating, what might making it worse. We're actually starting to believe now that asthma, like a lot of more autoimmune conditions, is related to things like the gut bacteria, whether we're getting a good amount of gut bacteria in on a daily basis, whether we've got the right bacteria in our gut, because they help modulate the immune response. But also whether we're then, because of the lack of bacteria, sensitive to certain foods. Cow's milk dairy is a very popular one. If you suffer with asthma, go on a trial of about a few weeks of having just goat's milk. So no A1 cow's milk. Cow's milk tends to come in two types. The A2 that we can digest properly, which is found in Guernsey milk and a little bit in Jersey milk. Jersey milk's about 50-50, A1 and A2. But the Guernsey milk tends to be more than 90% plus. The goat's milk is all A2, which is fantastic, which is much easier to digest. So I suggest most people go towards goat's milk because actually I find it much easier to digest. I think it's much nicer. It's actually much nicer, much more palatable. But actually the fats, when you homogenize the fats in normal milk, you actually change them. They're very normal. Cow's milk is something that we really shouldn't have in our diet. It's very, very highly inflammatory in its normal form. Now, if you take that cow and you have that milk raw, and unhomogenized, so unspun, then it's a completely different thing. It's the processing of the thing, not the actual origin. But again, A2, which is what we grew up on, but we over the centuries we've been drinking A2 milk as opposed to A1 milk. So we've actually overbred the kind of A1 type Frisian milk because the A1 Frisians tend to produce more milk, which obviously creates more money. But we actually don't, it gets broken down to something called casomorphin, which is very highly inflammatory for a lot of people. And a lot of general issues around the body can be caused or can be related by cow's milk protein intolerance. It's not an allergy. It's not going to set off a massive reaction. But in asthma sufferers, it actually could be part of the reaction. So that's the first thing to try. The second thing is asthma, particularly induced by exercise, is often a stress reaction. And what causes that stress reaction? Obviously, starting off too fast. Starting with that kind of hyped, amped kind of start of a race or a run, but also things like coffee and stimulants and using those is a very bad idea. But the other thing is on a local scale, i.e. in the lungs itself. If you take very fast, shallow breaths in through the mouth, you actually create an inflammatory response in the essentially the airways. What you should probably do, because the other thing is that brings in a lot of very, very cold air. So the person that asked the question actually said that in cold air, it gets worse. Well, the key thing is that your nose helps to warm and humidify that air. So if you suddenly take in some big deep breaths in through your mouth at the start of a run, that cold air stimulates that stress response in the upper lobes. You not only don't oxygenate properly, that makes you even more stressed, but that air is very cold and creates that reaction. So you need to start off every run slowly breathing in and out through the nose. And if you can't do that, you have to walk. You walk to breathe in through and out through the nose, then gradually build up the speed. You should be able to run almost full speed with breathing in through the nose. It's actually a fantastic tool for aeration, but you have to practice it. You have to try. A lot of people don't like doing it because they don't feel like it feels very nice. So it takes practice. So that's what we need to have a go at, breathing slowly in through the nose and seeing whether that changes then. And then thinking about the dietary changes. And then the other side of things is whether probiotics or more better fermented foods. So mostly when we have issues with that kind of protein, it's actually things like the bifidum species that we're lacking. So a well-fermented, good quality organic live yogurt can really, really help to actually lay some of those bacteria down. Often there's a lot more bacteria in a good yogurt than there is in a probiotic supplement. And what I actually do with mine, because I prefer goat's milk, and goat's milk yogurt is often very expensive and not very, very cost prohibitive, whereas cow's milk is a fraction of the price and actually has often better bacteria in, I actually ferment my own yogurt. So I bought myself a yogurt maker. They cost about £15-20 for an automatic one, or you can get a really basic one, or you can just simply do it and leave it in a nice warm place, because it only needs to be kept at about 35 degrees centigrade, which actually on top of a boiler is or you can keep it for a bit, ferment it for a little longer. But I take the goat's milk that I get, the good St. Helens goat's milk, and then I essentially ferment, or I boil off simmer very, very slowly some of the volume of the goat's milk. Then I add in a good few spoonfuls when it's cooled down to about 35 to 40 degrees. I add in a good few spoonfuls of the cow's milk. One I tend to use either the Year Valley one works very well. The home brand Morrison's ones work really well because they're actually purely bifidum. Bifidum is great at growing on its own. Then I add in a little spoon of raw honey, because all raw honey helps grow the bifidum. And then I leave it in the yogurt maker for about 7 to 8 hours, where it thickens up nicely and creates a beautiful goat's milk yogurt. Now, this can be fantastic at stopping all of those autoimmune conditions. We believe that we're reactive to all these foods these days. We believe gluten's causing problems, that milk causes problems, all these things. And actually, a lot of it comes down to the fact that our diet, we don't have as much of the fermented foods and that bacteria. The bacteria actually, they break down gluten. They break all those things down for us. They help us. They modulate our immune system, particularly the bifidum. And if they're not there, we have problems. I'm going to do some more podcasts about the microbiome, because it's possibly the most fascinating area that we're going into medicine at the moment. And then we're going to hopefully explore that a bit more. But those are the questions I want to answer for today. I hope you found that useful. I'm going to tag a few of the people that asked those questions in so that they actually can listen to this and actually get the answers. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you soon.